Hello and welcome to another edition of Birmingham Business TV. We are with our friends of Evelyn Partners in a room with a view in Colmore Row in Birmingham, a fabulous location, and we've got a huge range of topics to get through with you today. We've had 2 or 3 days now to digest the findings of the budget. And of course there's been plenty in it. The most important budget, some people have said, in a generation, the biggest tax raising budget in many years, which means there's lots of things for my first 2 guests to talk to right now. So Matt and Emma from Evelyn Partners, introduce yourselves, tell us a bit about your roles particularly here.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Emma Queen, I'm a business tax partner, so I look after private businesses, primarily supporting them on their growth and succession strategies on all things tax.
So Matthew Hughes, I'm a partner here too. I work in the private client sector, which means I do a very similar thing to Emma, but what I focus on is the entrepreneurs and the business owners themselves. But typically we will act, if you think of a Venn diagram where you have a business and their owner, both of us will try to operate in the overlap between those 2 sections.
And actually there's quite a lot within that Venn diagram overlap in this particular budget, wasn't there, particularly this time?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of capital gains and inheritance tax changes have been the ones that have made the headlines.
If I asked you to say, well, where was the most important thing to start, what would be the topic that you'd say, right, the first one I want to talk to you about is?
For businesses, employers' national insurance.
Did it surprise you? I mean, we seem to have had all the headlines for the budget before the budget came out, much to the dismay of the Speaker of the House of Commons. But even then, you don't quite know the degree of the increase.
No, I think we weren't surprised by the percentage increase of the 1.2% from 13.8 up to 15%. Nobody fell off their chair at that. The bit that really took us back was reducing the threshold to £5,000, so pretty much halved the threshold, which brings a lot more businesses into the scope of having to pay this tax. So that's where I think it's going to really bite.
And pretty much doubles the amount of money that Rachel Reeves earns through the change, doesn't it?
That's exactly right, yeah.
What can employers do about this? I mean, is it employers at the sort of who employ people at the lower end of the wage spectrum that are hit the hardest by this then, is it?
I think, so obviously there was that change. I think then there was the change around the national minimum wage going up, and even more so for young people. And then there are kind of these new workers' rights and moving much more towards not quite the French model, but looking towards that direction. So I think it's the package of those changes brought together that is really going to impact businesses, and naturally it's going to impact those businesses with a large number of lower paid workers. So your retail, your hospitality, that sort of industry, they are going to be hardest hit.
Can you see what the government's trying to do? Can you see the joined up picture from all of this or not?
Around with the employers' national insurance, because they'd said in the manifesto we're not going to increase employees' national insurance, income tax, corporation tax or VAT, they had no other choice to raise that amount of money. There's no other tax they could have gone after. So I'm not shocked in that sense. That's if she needed 40 billion, then 2025 had to come from employers' nick.
And Matt, let me ask you the same question. If there's one headline from your side of the operation.
Well, I think ahead of the budget, all the talk was about capital gains tax, but that actually ended up being a relatively modest increase. I think the most explosive change was that of IHT relief, so business property relief and agricultural property relief. I think that came as a big shock to family business owners, and I think will have really significant impact on how they behave over the coming generation.
And the capital gains tax side of things, I'd heard stories of how people who'd maybe been thinking about selling their business in the next year or 2 were suddenly rushing to try and get sales through before the budget, fearing that it was going to be a lot worse than it is. Do you still think what's happened is going to keep that trend going now?
So there certainly was a lot of activity ahead of the budget with transactions that were, I suppose, in process being accelerated, but to complete beforehand. I think that will probably slow a little now because, as I say, the rises were modest. But what I think is quite interesting generally in this budget is we think of tax as a way of influencing and modifying people's behaviours, and typically the policies of governments over the last few decades have always been about encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging risk taking, because that's what generates wealth for the economy, that generates employment. I think a lot of the changes that were announced have rode back on that type of policy, or in some cases completely reversed it, and I think that's probably what causes most worry for businesses and their owners at the moment.
And you talk about tax changing people's habits, lifestyles. I guess some of the inheritance tax rules, particularly around the agricultural industry, is really going to change the way people think, isn't it? And this is an area, I guess, for both of you, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that it really was a big change, and whilst there had been rumours around this, I think what's actually come out was quite explosive. I'm supposed to give that context. So business property relief was introduced about 50 years ago, and its purpose really is to limit disruption to businesses when the owner passes away, so the asset can effectively pass free of IHT on death. And that's been rolled back now, so that actually relief is effectively halved above a certain threshold, so above $1 million. And I think that's concerning to family businesses effectively, because there was a non-political objective behind that relief. This isn't a tax wheeze or tax avoidance. It is to stop shocks to businesses when an owner dies. And of course, when an owner dies, that is a shock to the business in itself, in that they may hold key relationships, they may be the driving force behind the business. And now we're in a position where families and businesses are going to need to find cash to pay the IHT. And I must admit, I question that as a policy. So I think in 2022, the combined reliefs, business property relief and agricultural property relief, raised £1.5 billion cost £1.5 billion in terms of release given for the Exchequer. So, forecast to raise that going forward. That is a tiny amount of tax. And actually, when you consider the risk that this introduces, so will businesses hold more cash and lower investment to protect against this? Will businesses sell up? And could that be to a foreign owner, for example? And if we sell to a foreign owner, then do we remove that business from the scope of UK tax entirely? Do we have the workforce being offshored, for example? These feel to me like big risks of, lack of other tax revenues through payroll, etc., and general GDP. And I'm not convinced that the upside of the additional tax is really worth this risk. SMEs, I think, are responsible for about 60% of the employment in the UK. And so these were really valuable protections that have had significant reductions applied really without any public debate or any professional consultation. And I think we're all quite concerned about that.
I think that's what's angered a lot of people. There wasn't any consultation on this with the business community or the farming community. So it has landed as a shock, and I think there is going to be a lot of pushback.
And I guess one of the reasons the agricultural community is so uptight about all this is that you've got the £1 million that's exemption, haven't you? But there are no farms really, because the land holding, the small holdings, that are going to be worth fewer than £1 million, aren't they? They're all going to get caught by this.
Not many. It'd be a small holding in most parts of the country. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think you add to that, obviously, the uncertainty around food production at the minute with Brexit and the EU subsidies falling away. I think a very difficult time for farmers and agriculture in general.
So this is really going to be of concern to maybe farmers or agricultural businesses where the current owner is towards the end of their career. And the other option, I guess, would be to start sort of gifting part of their business across. But if they haven't got time to do that, they haven't really got a way out, have they?
Yeah, and I think that's what we'll see in the longer term. People will have to bring succession planning forward, because one of the things that we thought might have changed in the budget that didn't was that sort of seven-year rule. The best inheritance tax planning you can do is to gift something and survive that gift by 7 years. But for some people, that's going to be too late. And so, the whole plan that they had for their succession, for their family business, it doesn't work anymore. And actually, they've not got time to put anything else in place. But yeah, longer term, I think that's what will happen. We'll see gifting come come forward somewhat.
But that in itself is quite interesting, because at the minute, with 100% relief across business property relief and agricultural property relief, people could make commercial decisions and family decisions. So when is the best time to pass the business? Is that in lifetime? Is that on death? Is that to a trust, for example? And you had quite a lot of flexibility, and your decision wasn't really driven by tax. But now we're in a position where actually, because of these reliefs falling away and lifetime gifting to a direct descendant or other family member becoming probably the most attractive option from a tax perspective, we're in this position where we have the tax tail leading the dog. And actually, is that the right commercial decision? Is that the best thing for the business? It may not be, but entrepreneurs and farmers will be influenced by tax. So we go back to this point of tax is there to influence people's behaviour, and I'm not sure we've shifted in the way that we really should be focusing on, because we're focusing now on tax instead of commercial decisions.
And this can't have been the intention of the government. The message that's coming out of this is they want it to be a budget for growth, a budget to free people up, to want to expand, to invest, to be entrepreneurial. How does that all piece together with that objective?
It doesn't, to be honest. I don't think anybody is now sitting back and reflecting that was in any sense a budget for growth. It was a hard budget. It was a hard budget for business to swallow, certainly. I just don't think you can.
I think the government should be very worried about unintended consequences. So we haven't spoke about it yet today, but the IHT regime has changed as well, effectively, so that if you leave the UK for more than 10 years, you will fall outside of the scope of UK IHT. So will these changes in combination push business owners to leave the UK, perhaps in their 50s or 60s, so that actually these assets ultimately can fall outside of the scope of IHT entirely, and then you have an owner that's no longer connected to the business because they're living overseas? It just doesn't add up to me as a pro-business or sensible sort of plan, if I'm honest.
I mean, aside from IHT, there was already a suggestion, wasn't there, that some of the other measures that were being trailed in the budget might provoke a lot of business people, particularly in the wealthier end of the spectrum, to look at leaving the UK as well. So
yeah, and we've seen the non-dom rules scrapped. That's probably a popular decision for the electorate as a whole.
And that would have happened whichever government had been elected, wouldn't it? So
certainly no surprise, but there is a question of, what impact will that have? I think those non-dom rules, despite being perhaps unpopular, they served a purpose, which was to attract high net worth individuals from outside of the UK to come into the UK, spend money in the UK, hopefully set up businesses in the UK. Now, clearly, whether that happened or not is an area for debate, but it may not happen so much going forward. And ultimately, what impact that has on the economy and tax revenues is, to be seen, I guess.
You mentioned that some of the things have been introduced without consultation. One of the things I'm right in saying that the government are consulting on is this idea of bringing pensions into an inheritance tax arena as well. That's a very complicated thing to actually do, isn't it, from a practical point of view?
Yes, and I think that's going to impact financial planning for a lot of people. So pensions have always been able to be passed down to the next generation without any inheritance tax. That is just one of many tax reliefs attached to pensions. So they have been a very tax efficient vehicle to invest in. But that shift now is going to mean that people's pension pots won't be left until last. People will be looking at their investment portfolio more widely and revising their strategy.
Could this have an adverse impact on the number of people that actually want to invest in pensions now then? Or?
Possibly, and I think we go back to that point of tax influencing behaviour. We could now end up in a position where, let's say an individual has £1 million pension pot when they die, and that passes on, so there'd be 40% IHT on that, and then the beneficiary drawing it out could potentially be subject to 40-45% of income tax as well. So you end up with an effective tax rate of about 64%, which doesn't seem to me like a high incentive for people to save during their lifetime. So again, it's this I suppose there's a friction between raising revenue but then having people behave and incentivising the behaviour that you want to see in the economy. I think the pension thing's less contentious than some of the reliefs, because you could argue this is to make people spend their pensions, which would have a positive effect. But it just forms part of this picture, I think, where we're not necessarily aligning the tax system with the behaviours I think we probably all want to see in the UK.
I get reading some of the headlines in the first couple of days after the budget. My impression was the biggest worry from a pension point of view is that now that this has been done, is there a fear that pensions are fair game for other attacks, for want of a better word, in current, subsequent budgets? Or
We don't know.
Where's your crystal ball? Come on.
We don't know. We have thought a little bit about that, particularly with capital gains tax. That didn't go quite as far as a lot of us had feared. So I think there is scope to do more in the next budget. I don't expect the next budget to be a quiet one, or particularly, or an uncontroversial one.
I think the two changes that people are worried about on pensions were reducing the tax-free lump sum, and I feel like the government have veered away from that, because that would feel grossly unfair if people have saved their whole life and have earmarked a pot to come out to pay off a mortgage or something similar to change that. So maybe that is a low risk of change, because again that would be sort of deeply unpopular. I think the other change that was touted significantly was effectively capping the level of income tax relief available when you put money into a pension. So high earners can currently get a lot of relief, and I suppose there's a question as to whether that is what the government wanted, because actually it's probably low to middle earners where they really want people to be encouraging to put into a pension. So that's possibly a more likely change than the taxation of the lump sum.
Was there anything that you were surprised wasn't in the budget?
Growth strategies. No, I don't think so.
I mean, most things were in the budget, to be fair, weren't they? It was a pretty busy one.
Looking back on it, it was very much focused on businesses, and businesses don't have a vote, and the people do. So I think that's quite an interesting tactic there. There were a few things where consultations were announced, so around kind of employee ownership trust, there were some consultation comments issued, business rates review again, more consultation. So there's lots of kind of things they could have gone for, but it was more sort of planting the seeds of change in the future that we saw. There wasn't anything that wasn't in the budget that we thought would have been.
Have you spotted anything in the small print? Because you get the headline findings, don't you, when the Chancellor stands up, and then they always say the devil's in the detail, and you've got to pour into the report and find some of the things that maybe weren't actually championed.
Well, I think the things that people should be careful about in general are where changes are announced to take place from April 26, say, or April 27. In the fine print, there are often what are called anti-forestalling rules, which basically stop you doing things before April 26 or April 27 to avoid the rule changes. People should be very careful about that and take proper advice before they go ahead and implement plans.
Anything that you would have liked to have seen that wasn't?
I think the key thing for me that we didn't see is rewarding entrepreneurship. We look at capital gains tax rates now, and it was only sort of 6-9 months ago where the differential in tax rate between selling a business and selling a second home was 18 percentage points, and it's now 6 percentage points. And I go back to the same point, that just doesn't feel like the type of tax system that we want to encourage risk-taking and entrepreneurship and building a business. And I just wish we'd had more that aligned, I think, incentives with behaviours in a way that we wanted to see them.
Have you had time to assess what the reaction's been with some of your clients? Have you had conversations with them already? What's the mood?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think, like I mentioned earlier, those clients who employ a lot of lower paid workers, so with the minimum wage and employers' national insurance and the workers' rights to consider, they are, now very much in planning mode at least, and thinking about potentially changing their business strategy, and is this going to be affordable? how do I plan in the long term for this? So yeah, definitely a bit of a pivot in terms of looking at the commercial strategy. I think more widely, when you're looking at succession, people there'll be more capital transactions. I think there's now more incentive to sell your business rather than pass it on. So yeah, we're going to see a mixed pool of investors, I think, as Matt alluded to earlier, coming into the UK and taking ownership of UK businesses.
Matt, what from your point of view, what do you think?
Pretty similar, actually. I think you're absolutely right. I think there was mixed sentiment from clients. So I think they were relieved at some of the CGT changes. For example, didn't go as far as you mentioned they could have gone, but things like IHT, etc., that came out of the woodwork were a shock to them. But businesses will adapt, and they will do what they need to do. And we just hope, I think, that the next budget brings a bit more consistency, and we have some clarity over what's going forward in the future.
So if you're giving this budget a mark out of 10, maybe then, based on what you'd hoped it would do and what it did, where does it stand? Who's going to be brave enough to go first?
Well, I think look, I'd start with 2 out of 10. I think maybe when you take into account that they did need to raise revenue, I might be generous and give it a 5. But no, I don't want to keep labouring the point about influencing people's behaviours, but frankly, I think they made a lot of big decisions, and I can't see that they've got many of them right.
Yeah.
It's been tough. What do you think?
I'd have gone 4 or 5. 3 for the entrepreneurs and business owners and people really looking to build business and wealth. It was not a good budget for those aspirational people that we want to be here. We want them to be successful and achieving and employing the people in our communities. From a larger business perspective, we did have some certainty with the publication of the business tax roadmap. Now, there was nothing too dramatic in there, to be honest, but it was a commitment, and it was a commitment to a certain path that we're going to be following now, and just that helps businesses to make investment decisions. They can make more informed choices, so that is a positive, that certainty.
And it certainly means you're going to be having lots of conversations with lots of people about lots of different kinds of things over the next few months, doesn't it?
We were very busy in the run-up to the budget, and we were hoping we might get some downtime, but I don't think that's going to happen.
No holiday, no downtime over Christmas, New Year. Forget about it. Forget about it. Matt, Emma, thank you so much for your time. Really great to catch up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've analysed the budget, we've gone through the many points that Rachel Reeves presented to Parliament. We're now going to turn our attention to international trade. So let me introduce the 3 guests that we've got with us now. We've got Rick Shaw and Matt Watts from Evelyn Partners and John Salmon of Santa Fe. Before we start, gents, just tell us a little bit about your particular role.
So my name's Matt Watts, and I work with businesses who are looking to trade internationally, typically from the UK, so that's UK outbound businesses.
Hi there, I'm Rick Shaw. I'm an international tax partner, particularly focused on supporting businesses with managing their compliance obligations for moving employees into or out of the UK.
Hi, I'm John Salmon. I work for Santa Fe. I'm a senior business lead for a global relocation management company, primarily in the relocation destination and moving space, supporting companies on a global scale with their employee and employer journey.
Excellent, thank you very much. You explained your roles far better than I would have been able to, so that's a good move. Let's get straight down to it then, shall we, with the question that, what's the motivation for companies that makes them want to expand? Why do they want to do it? Who wants to take that one?
I'll go first, if that's okay. Well, particularly the US seems to be a target market for a lot of companies. I've been doing a lot of work recently with the Department of Business and Trade, and they released some information, some statistics about the US market in particular. The 4 quarters up to the second half of 2024, it's a $188 billion export location, with 22% of trade coming out of the UK going into the US. So the feeling is that there's a big market there to exploit, and it's a well-trodden path. Particularly, and few sectors as well. So a number of trade advisors have highlighted the tech industry, food industry in particular, and also life sciences as well. So it feels like there's a big opportunity to expand into that market.
But I guess with big opportunity comes the need for big, proper, sensible planning before you actually dip your toe in the water, doesn't it?
Absolutely right. And I think part of that is getting the people part of that right.
It's getting the right people, for sure. I mean, I think there's two sides to that. There's the actual individuals that you need to perhaps take over to the US to be able to basically take their knowledge and their skill set and take it over to the new market, so they can share that knowledge and share that culture and understanding of the business itself. But also you've got the local market itself in the US, which is obviously it's such a wide pool of talent in essence, so we can go to that market and utilise and find the correct individuals for the right roles. So it's a combination of both that you're looking at from a talent perspective.
Because culture is a huge thing, isn't it? You know, on the face of it, we all speak a version of English on both sides of the Atlantic. So there's a common bond there, isn't there? But in other ways, for a company to thrive in a marketplace overseas, you've got to have some locals there, haven't you? And they maybe have the cultural knowledge, but not the business knowledge. Is that you're nodding at that one?
I think that's right, Carl. Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a common misconception that we are very similar to the US in terms of our business culture. And yes, there are similarities, but there are so many differences as well. And one of the key differences that UK businesses in particular can often overlook is the huge variation in terms of the regional variations within the US.
You've got 50 governments, effectively, haven't you? Really?
Exactly right. And I think it's therefore really important to understand that. And I think that will go on to sort of dictate a lot of key factors in terms of what businesses look at when they're looking at the US. They need to understand sort of where you need to be. That's the first question. I think you really need to ask, because the regional variations is so vast. It's a bit like sort of looking at the US. Yes, it's one country, but actually it's 50 different countries, and you should consider it more like the EU in that respect. And
are there states within the US that you like? If somebody says we want to expand into Illinois or whatever it is, and do you roll your eyes and think, oh no, not Illinois, they're one of the worst to deal with? How different are the differences between the various states?
Oh, they are very stark. I mean, I think one of the key things to consider is the cost. Sort of different states have different sort of cost levels when looking to set up. It won't come as a surprise, I don't think, to many of your viewers that, for example, New York is a very, very expensive state to be in. And therefore, if you want to be in New York and a business needs to be in New York, then you have to be there. But you must understand that the cost of doing business in New York is going to be a lot higher than sort of a lot of the other the US states.
It's, I guess, the same as the situation over here. People think we want to be based in London. Well, you be based in London, yes, you're in the biggest city, but actually the overheads, the transport, the accommodation, it all has to be thrown in, doesn't it?
I think you need to know why you're choosing a particular location, and there could be a number of factors. On the point of cost, different states have state tax for individuals. So if you employ in a location that has state tax, there's going to be a tax consequence for individuals, particularly if you're sending individuals to live and work in the US. But by the same token, if you need people to be in a similar time zone, then as Matt said, you might choose East Coast, so that they're closer aligned to maybe the C-suite back in the UK. It could be that that's an easier transport link as well. You can get there more quickly, or vice versa. It's really understanding what all the factors are, and absolutely if you decide a particular location, then understanding what the consequences of that are.
Yeah. Particularly, I guess, because a lot of the people that you're going to be talking to, they're not looking to move lock, stock and barrel from the UK to the US. They're looking at having a presence both sides of the Atlantic then. So,
absolutely. It's, I think to quantify, it's like those local nuances. Without understanding the local nuances in each particular state or location in the US will drive and determine which is the best way forward. How should that entity be set up, what that should look like, what's the considerations around the tax elements of that. When you relocate somebody, each state has different requirements around how to move somebody into what location, even to the little detail of relocating somebody into a particular type type of property, some places don't have white goods, some do have white goods. So it's so detailed about what you're looking to do and over what timeline that move looks like. And that touches also on the visa elements as well. Depending how you set the business up will determine what type of visa you will require and over what timeline. So you've got to really dig deep and pre-plan and really understand your marketplace before you can take that first step. And that's always something that I would always suggest as early as possible.
We're going to be talking a little bit later on with one of the other panels about companies looking to bring their business into the UK, and I guess we'll talk about the Brexit implications and the paperwork implications. What are the paperwork implications like between UK and US? I guess it's not straightforward.
No, it isn't, Carl. The US is very high in terms of the number of rules and regulations. So there's a barrier to entry there. And what businesses can find is that they can trigger requirements to register in the US before they've actually realised that, and that's really sort of key thing to understand. You must take advice sort of as soon as you practically can to ensure that you're not sort of triggering requirements to register in the US for so it's not even just for tax reasons, could be sort of other legal reasons before you've actually sort of realised it.
I know some of the statistics that I've seen that you guys have got showing the interest in moving into the US shows just how strong the demand for the market is. But is that because it's the best place to be if you want to be in an overseas market, or is it just because it's the best known? Is it the right, or automatically the right decision for everyone? I
mean, it's still, in terms of GDP, it's still the biggest market for businesses to go at, even though, yes, as we've talked about, there's a lot of regional variations, but when you look at the US economy sort of as a whole, it's still by far and away the biggest market. So businesses feel that they need to be there.
I agree with that.
So let's talk about a checklist, if you like, a mental checklist, crucial factors that businesses need to bear in mind if they're going to get it right. Where do they start? What do they need to do? Is there a list of half a dozen things you've got to say, right, fulfill all of these before you even start being serious?
Well, I think the first thing to ask yourself is why you're going. Is it to access the market, as we've already touched on? Is it to access sort of the skill set and the workforce? Because that will then dictate, I think, where you need to be within the US. And that's a key question, as we've already touched on as well. I think from that, you will then start to understand how much of a presence you need to have in the US. For example, a manufacturing business might be able to start trading in the US through a series of third-party warehousing arrangements, and that can be quite light touch in terms of so having a presence in the US. Whereas if you're a service industry, you need people on the ground, then you're probably going to have to establish and register sort of a separate legal entity in some way, shape or form in the US from the outset. So I think it's really understanding why you're going, what you're trying to achieve, and then I think from that, a lot of these other sort of questions will flow and will follow.
And John, from a people point of view, what's top of your list? The first conversation you'd want to have with a business thinking of going?
First conversation, it sort of depends on, I think, Matt, you just touched on, it's whether they set it up, depending on the route they set up. Employed a records company where you don't necessarily actually need to have an entity. You can just move in, you can be into the US very quickly, by about a week, 10 days, as long as you set up the necessary parameters in place to do that. Or if you're doing it from an entity perspective, then you're really taking it back down to understanding which particular visa will relate to the particular type of entity you're setting up. And you're talking about the individual that's moving, what level of budget will they expect to support that individual moving from A to B. And then you're going into the detail of they need somewhere to live, they need somewhere to have children, what time of the year they're moving to that particular country or particular area. There's so many components that need to be considered before you make that final decision that this person needs to move from A to B. So there's a whole list, but starting with visas, understanding why they're going and the rationale behind it, and the timelines are ultimately key to make sure that works.
And timeline-wise, is there a good time of year, a quick time of year, a slow time of year? How does it work?
There's 2 points. It's never too early is the first point, but we still work on quite a lot of individuals will work on schooling timelines of if they have children, then it needs to be.
I was going to ask you that.
Ideally,
You've got a family. You've got to find a school. It's got to start at the start of an academic year. You might want to.
In an ideal world, but on the flip side, that doesn't necessarily always work because as the guys from the tax part can talk about, it's it may cross over two tax years,
Yeah.
and Rick can talk a bit more detail about how that looks like. So just because you want it to happen on day X, it may not be able to, and then there's more considerations around that from a tax point of view.
John set you up, Rick. Now it's all
Yes,
yours.
I'll
thank
do my
you, John.
best.
There's something here about John said it, timelines and understanding what your time pressures are. Do you need someone now? In which case there are mechanisms to do that very quickly. If you can prepare for the right answer, then all those things that we've talked about, so family going, that potentially being the start point, and timing with school years is a big part of that, but understanding the compliance complications of that, because it doesn't fit very neatly with our tax year, which ends at a very different point to the US one. And if you're quite a small company that doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, you could find yourself managing quite a lot of tax compliance in 2 locations, and it's possible to get around that if you plan ahead, get some advice and manage that. And the upside of that is less stress for the individual, so they can focus on the job, which is why you're sending them in the first place. And secondly, you could bring the cost of doing that down quite significantly, because you're in one known tax system, and potentially structuring the package in a way that you maximise the efficiency of it and reduce the cost for the business. And I think something that a lot of businesses don't really appreciate when they're sending their first person is it can actually cost about 2 to 4 times what you're paying the person to send someone on secondment. But as we've said, there's a quid pro quo of hiring locally versus sending people that you trust into the business. And it's trying to get that right balance. And as both of my colleagues have said, it's understanding what the key factors are for starting business in the US and what your timeline is. I think that knowing those 2 things is really important.
And in a lot of occasions, do you actually have to hold back on some of this until you're actually there to do? You can't do it all before you go, can you?
I think the answer is it depends. Depends what you're doing. I think, as John was saying, we had a client come to us recently. He had found the right candidate in the US to drive sales in the US, knows the market, the right person for the business to take the business forward, but they don't have a presence in the US. So the question was, what do we do in this situation? Yeah. And the honest answer was, you can use an external agency, as John was talking about, their employer of record, that can issue a legally compliant contract, get someone employed onto a payroll within a matter of days, which to a business that doesn't have that infrastructure is pretty good, frankly, to do that quickly. But there will come a point where that's not the right structure, because that only works where that individual isn't having a bigger impact on the business. And there will come a tipping point, as Matt was talking about, where you will reach a point where you need a more substantive presence. So to your point, Carl, there will typically be a point where you have to make a decision about whether you need something more formal.
And does it make a difference with all of this, whether you are maybe a medium or large-sized corporate or an owner-managed business? Does that shape what you need to do in the order you need to do it then?
The US is quite draconian when it comes to how it applies a lot of its regulations, and unlike the UK, where we do have a sort of lighter touch sort of approach for small businesses who are looking to start up, the US will typically kick in from day one, and therefore that's why you get this situation where businesses can trigger filing requirements before they've actually sort of even realise it. So typically, the rules apply regardless of the size of business.
But just to add to that, the impact and the incentive for the individual is going to be even larger for the founder or owner. I know, John, you were talking about this before. You wanted to talk about the difference on immigration requirements going in at that.
Yeah, so depending on the seniority of the individual will determine the type of visa that you need to take. It's a very long process, like a business plan that you have to put in place to the US sort of government, in effect, to ascertain exactly why you're opening that entity, the reasons behind it, and why you need those individuals to actually make that move to that location. So it's not as simple as some locations around the world, where really if A and B make C, you're in. There has to be a real consecrated sort of effort and a lot of time to be able to get that process in place to make sure that it happens. So making sure, again, we go back to pre-planning, identifying what that business looks like, what the process is, how you can get to the end goal is absolutely integral to being a successful transition. And just touching on individuals that relocate, the key thing for them is they want a positive transition moving into a new country, especially being the first move of its kind from an international expansion perspective. It needs to be right, it needs to be comfortable, they need to be happy in their environment. So all of these elements that we've discussed across this this platform today is really important to making sure that it's right from both the employer and the employee's perspective.
I mean, you've all been operating in this arena for quite some time now, so I guess you've got quite a library of case studies, of anecdotes, of examples of things that have gone well, things that maybe could have been done differently. Are there any that jump out for you?
I mean, yes, both good and bad, Carl. I'm sort of sorry to say in many respects. I think typically when it works well, it's when businesses have thought really, really carefully about why they're going and where they need to be. I think typically where it hasn't gone as well is where sort of businesses just haven't thought about sort of why they're going to the US, where they need to be, because then sort of you find yourself quite often having to unpick sort of decisions that have been taken in haste.
And that's harder, isn't it?
It is a lot harder, yeah. I mean, another option can be, and I've got a client who's recently done this, is actually sort of partnering up with a business who's already in the US, sort of either through sort of merger or acquisition, because then you've already got a footprint, sort of in the States, and you've got channels, sort of to use, and clearly that's not going to be accessible or the right route for every business, but that's another alternative.
And if you do that, just going back to your people point in immigration, does that make it easier for people to actually get into the US if you've already got a partner over there of some sort?
It can do, depending on the industry you're in and the product or the service that you're trying to deliver. So each visa requirement in the US is taken upon individually, in essence. So it is determined by all of those elements. So to a degree, but you've still got to go through a process, and that's important. That it's getting it right from the start, understanding the marketplace, determining what route is the best course of action, and then that outlines you what route you take from an entity or a visa perspective.
Rick, any other case studies or anecdotes or things that spring to mind for you?
Just drawing on a couple of those comments I was making before, move 2 or 3, if you're sending your trusted lieutenants out to carry on the business on your behalf, tend to be easier because you learn from what's gone wrong the first time, unfortunately. It's often what's gone wrong because that's typically the point where advice is sought. But if you can get ahead of that and prepare, as I said, there's cost savings to be had. There's a better experience for the individual as well, understanding what's coming their way, and more clarity around who's picking up which tax consequences and what that means for the individual. I've seen good and bad, much like Matt said. I think typically, to your question before, larger corporates with maybe a more established structure around sending people on assignment tend to have people who've done this before, as opposed to smaller businesses where this is part of someone's job to get someone there effectively, and it's quite a big undertaking to do it for the first time. So my I guess plea is talk to people who've done it before, get some advice, because there are lots of people that are keen to share what they've done. We'd be included in that bracket, what works, what doesn't, tips to be successful and do things more effectively.
And do that right at the start before you start your planning, rather than get so far down the line and think, actually, I could probably do know a bit more about this. Because
exactly. From a tax perspective, you can do things a little bit to a degree retrospectively, and things like visa processing, timelines around how long you can be out in country for. No, you can't. So there's pros and cons to both.
Are there sort of common pitfalls that people will make? Mistake? Do you have a sort of a red light and you think we need to make sure they don't do that?
So I'll just take the first point. Again, we're touching on immigration, but it's that can I or can't I go and work in that particular country whilst I'm determining which course or route I'm going to take. So the business visit visa, for example, it's a very vanilla grey area in terms of what that looks like. So what constitutes business practical working, and what constitutes you can go there for a conference or a meeting, as long as it's not revenue generating. So if it's any of those business visit visas are fine. If it falls outside of any of those jurisdictions, ensure you do the right thing and get the appropriate work permits, because that can cause an issue not just for individuals, but for the business from a compliance perspective and also reputational risk. So that would be the one takeaway from that part of things.
And I would say there's going to be, there already is, but there's going to be increasing connection between immigration and the IRS in the US, an alignment there. So if there's someone that's not on the correct visa, that will follow through into the tax considerations of that. So I totally agree with John about not flouting, using an ESTA, for example, to travel to the US for genuine work purposes. Have you got any other?
Yeah, well, I think just following on from that, and an extension to it is understanding where you've got filing requirements.
Yeah.
So yeah, you might set up in one of the states, but if you've got sort of transactions with customers in multiple states, then you may already have a requirement to register in those states. And understanding that is really, really challenging, particularly if you're not used to that sort of different regional sort of variation that we've touched on.
I don't want to finish on pitfalls because that's a negative thing. Let's finish on positives. Any top tips for success? And if there's one thing that you'd like people to take away if they're thinking about the US as a possible market, they should think about what? Who wants to go first?
I think get advice. As soon as you're thinking about sort of looking to the US for expansion, take advice. Work out why you're going and ensure that you're clear on that and speak to people who've done this before.
Okay.
I'd say know your timelines, because there's a lot of fantastic solutions out there. The US is a hugely advanced economy that has provided solutions to get there and do business really quickly. So it's possible to be up and running very quickly if it's right for your circumstances. But understanding what your timelines are, particularly if you're not quite sure on sending or recruiting locally, I think is really important.
I think we're all covering similar bases, but market research, understand the market. You know, just because you feel you should, does that make it the reason for why you actually do make that decision? So do the market research, understand the conditions of the country, understand all those things you need to consider for best practices to make that move. And between all the three elements that we've just discussed, hopefully you'll be in a good place to consider making that decision to do it.
Yeah, common thread, plan it properly, take your time and speak to the experts, isn't it? John, Rick, Matt, thank you so much for your time, really appreciate it. We'll be talking more international trade a little bit later on, specifically about companies wanting to come into the UK rather than out of the UK. But it's now time for our 90 Seconds With feature, where we put someone in the hot seat to find out a little bit more about them, their business, their work, their pleasure, maybe some things you never knew. Let's find out who we've got this time.
What's the biggest challenge in your job?
Finding the right people and retaining them.
How do you think your colleagues would describe you?
Collaborative.
What qualities do you look for in colleagues?
People that work together and want to do the right thing for clients.
The biggest decision you've ever made professionally?
Hiring decisions and taking a chance on some people.
Advice you would give to your younger self?
Be more curious and experiment more.
The biggest influence on your business career?
Member of family.
Early bird or night owl?
Both.
Your favourite place to unwind?
With family.
Gym workout, stroll in the park or TV box set?
TV box set.
Your ultimate live concert?
Robbie Williams.
Favourite film?
Gladiators.
Your dream dinner guest, dead or alive?
Winston Churchill.
Welcome back. Well, it's time now to turn our attention to the topic of business exits. And as we heard in our budget roundup earlier, it's become more prevalent probably than it has been for some time, given some of the changes in policy that the Chancellor has introduced. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail with our two guests that we've got here in the studio. We've got Annabelle Mason from Evelyn Partners and Mike Yanis from Stantec. And Mike, you were just explaining to me that you've seen this process from pretty much all different stages of the change.
Yes, I've been fortunate in that my career has been all about buying and selling businesses. So I spent the first 20 years of my career as an advisor, corporate finance advisor, advising clients on buying and selling. So over that period, sold about 200 businesses over that period. But got a bit bored of actually doing it for others. So the last 8-9 years, I changed tact and became a business investor. and took a position in a number of businesses and have sold a number of those over the last couple of years as well. So I've seen both sides of the fence and been through a lot of transactions.
Is that gamekeeper turned poacher
That's
or the other way
the other way around, depending on...
Has that made you look at your previous job in a different way now?
Definitely, yeah, and I think it's better to be a client than an advisor for sure, at least financially.
Annabelle, tell us a bit about your specific role then.
So I'm tax director, so a lot of what I do with helping businesses is looking at the tax aspects of it. So what can we do to get the best tax position for them, for the clients when they're selling the businesses. And I think on that, it is sort of, we mentioned earlier, it's all about that forward planning. So looking at what do you want, how do you want to achieve it? And then we can layer in what that might mean from a tax perspective and how we work through that to get the best outcome for everybody involved.
And not wanting to put words into your mouth, but I imagine one of the most important things for you is that you can get in at ground level when the planning is not even started yet.
Absolutely. There's a number of different things with tax where actually you need to have the structure in place for potentially 1-2 years in advance of an exit event. So, you know, if you come to us the day before, we might be slightly limited what we can do, but that forward planning means that we can look at different options and get it into the right structure for the business.
Does that happen, that you get a lot of people that come to you a lot later than they should have done?
They tend to come a lot later than we would like them to come. Yeah, forward planning is definitely our preference.
Right, just talk us through some of the reasons then maybe why somebody would be looking to sell.
The most obvious one is to realise value from their potentially lifetime lifetime investment and work. So crystallisation of investment, retirement sale is typically the most common reason. Sometimes a business owner has taken the business as far as they can given their capabilities or given the sector that they operate in, and they're better off being part of a larger group. So the shareholders may not necessarily want to leave or even retire, but they've taken the business as far as they can, and they can thrive by being part of that bigger group. So they're the two most common reasons.
Do sometimes people need to be told, though, that they've taken the business as far as they can? Because it's harder to take an outside look into a business, isn't it, sometimes?
Yeah, it takes a very wise, astute business owner to accept that they've got limitations in their capability, absolutely.
Does that, Annabelle, mean some difficult conversations with big sometimes?
Yeah, definitely, because it's just a case of, you know, understanding what they want and then trying to sort of broach that with the realities of the business, how it's operating, the opportunities. And it can be that exit, it might be to someone, you know, entirely independent, but also you could start to look at, well, are there people in the business that I like what they're doing, I want them to take it forwards. And on that, sometimes it's a bit easier for kind of the main business holders in that situation because they know who's going to take it forward. But then you're balancing, well, they probably don't have the cash to buy out the exiting shareholders on day one. So how can we get it to work together? And of course, when you've done a sale, if you're still partially involved, I think on a personal level, it can be quite difficult for those people, for both sides, really.
And sometimes, whether this is the smaller the business, maybe the more the people know every single member of staff in a business.
Yeah.
And there's the sort of urge to be completely open and honest and transparent with people, and you can't always do that, though, can you?
No, absolutely. It's really, really hard to manage that. And sort of, Mike, I know you were sort of mentioning in terms of actually having the skill set in the business to actually deal with the sales process itself and those individuals sort of helping.
Yeah, one of my key recommendations to anyone considering a business exit is to appoint an advisor. And that's an advisor on the corporate finance side to process and manage the transaction, tax advisors and lawyers. They're the three key advisors that you need to line up. And then if you have a chance of, if you're confident of the money coming through, then getting your wealth manager lined up as well. But having advisors on board ensures that things like confidentiality and keeping the business trading as well as possible during the process is very important.
Timing, I guess, is really important as well, isn't it?
That's probably get ready, get advisors on board, but get your timing right, because everything is about timing. And this is all around both what I would call internal timing, i.e. making sure you get your business in the best condition possible and trying to coincide that with the external market conditions also being as positive as possible for the sale. And I've got too many examples where clients at the time held on for too long, and they lived to regret it because they were being greedy, they wanted a bit more, something happened in the market, and value eroded as a result. So you've got to leave enough behind for the next owner. So leave enough on the table, and just, there's a lot of luck involved, but try and get the timing right, absolutely.
But on the flip side, I imagine if something does happen in the economy that you could capitalise on, you need to be agile enough to suddenly say, right, bang, we're going.
Absolutely.
Be sort of aware enough and able enough to do it. And that's when having the right skills at your fingertips is crucial, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the business I'm most heavily involved in, we're an engineering consultancy. And I guess 4 or 5 years ago, we saw the big push towards all things net zero and sustainability. So we very quickly repositioned ourselves from being, what on the face of it was just very traditional engineering, design consultants, structural and civil engineers and so on. And we became the saviours of the world, all about sustainability, net zero, designing much more sustainable buildings and the built environment. And that really transformed both our financial performance and eventual exit as well.
We talked briefly about the budget at the very start of this. Has what Rachel Reeves has announced changed the kind of dialogue that you may be having with us? Has it accelerated conversations with some people about exits?
I think it's going to be, forward planning is even more important than ever. And that's not just sort of what we're talking about necessarily with forward planning in terms of how long a sales process can take, but it's actually really starting to plan much, much earlier from a succession perspective. So I think previously, especially the agricultural industry, because everything sort of tends to go down the generations, that's sort of how it passes down. They would just sort of done all of that on death, quite straightforward, no real inheritance tax issues to worry about. Obviously, the changes to inheritance tax are going to be huge for them because they have got to forward plan. They've got to start thinking about, well, who should be owning the business, the assets, all of those things. So I think it's more important than ever to forward plan, thinking ahead.
Family businesses particularly, I guess, right, this would apply to, wouldn't it? When you're wearing your CFO hat then, what kind of things are you having to advise people on?
Well, the starting point is understanding the shareholders' objectives, because the eventual outcome of what process one goes through depends on what their objectives are. And in some instances, it is purely all about money. All they want to do is maximize the value. They don't care who the business goes to. They just want to sell and get out. In many instances, to be fair, that's not the case, because they built the business over their lives. They've got a genuine love and affection for the business and the people that work in it. So they want to ensure the business goes to a good home. In other instances, they're very happy just to pass it on to the employees as well. So understanding the shareholders' objectives, what are their value aspirations, what are their, how long do they want to stay involved in the business, and what type of new ownership are they interested in, then determines what the exit route should be. And that then pushes you down either doing a sale to an employee ownership trust, for example, where employees take over, or to a management buyout, or it could be just a trade sale, or even to private equity. So there's many different options out there, but each one is more suitable for certain sort of shareholder objectives that you need to try and match up.
And also on that, it's thinking about when they get the money, what do they want to do with it? So do they want to just realise as much as possible, sail off into the sunset, so they want it all in their back pocket? Or actually, if they're very entrepreneurial, they actually might go, well, I want to use most of the proceeds, if not all, and set up a new business. And that influences how we might look to structure it. So it's not just sort of, it's looking on both elements. It's looking forwards and at the current position.
Talk to me about tax, because you've talked about inheritance tax specifically, but what are the other tax considerations that have to be looked at?
So, I mean, there's capital gains tax. So again, it's, if you want the money in your back pocket, you're looking at capital gains tax that's payable by the individual. If you're looking at reinvesting, we might look at a structure where actually we can get it's into a corporate entity, but it's actually a tax-free sale. So again, it's balancing what you want as an individual with what that means from a tax perspective. And on some of it, when you're looking at reliefs and different things, it's actually going, well, what's the amount you actually want? We'll get you the best tax rate, but if it's the worst position, are you still happy with the money that you're ending up with? And if the answer to that is yes, it's a lot easier. If it's, well, no, I've got to have this bit, it makes the tax a little bit harder to manage.
We talked about capital gains tax going up in the budget, both levels of it. Do you think it's gone up enough to make people think that they need to change their minds? What do you think, Michael? Some people expected it to go up more, didn't they?
Absolutely. There were some real horror stories coming out of it going up to, well, equalising with income tax rates, or sort of 39-40%. And I'm aware of friends and colleagues in the industry that were killing themselves to get deals done before the 30th of October. In the end, the increase in percentage terms wasn't that great, so I don't think it's changing business owners' decisions that much. Yes, there's more CGT to pay, and I think most people will accept that. I think the change to inheritance tax and the business property relief that Annabelle mentioned earlier, I think that will have a bigger impact on decisions, because family-owned businesses will probably be pushed towards selling rather than passing them through the generations to avoid what would be quite an expensive inheritance tax charge. So that's probably a bigger impact on business exits than maybe capital gains tax changes will be.
Are people in general terms looking to sell maybe a little bit earlier than they were? I know there was a report as we came out of the pandemic, people saying they were looking at sort of altering their work-life balance and deciding, right, we might just allow ourselves a little bit more time to spend our money. Have you seen that? Maybe.
I mean, it comes back to the price, doesn't it, as to what are they actually going to get when they sell the business. So, and I think that's the important side of that, is actually reflecting on what do they want. You know, if that's what they want to do, they want to look at, work-life balance. You're then looking at, right, well, how much money do you need for the rest of your life? What figure does it need to be that you sell it for? And then it's a case of, really sort of assessing that side of it. So it might be that the business was worth 10 million, but you want it to be worth 20 million. But actually, with some financial planning work, it's realised that, well, you only really need 12 million for the life that you want for the rest of, the rest of your day. So sometimes it's not necessarily the headline figure, it's what figure do you need?
And that's probably one of the things that's changed among a lot of people in terms of their desires, their expectations and their lifestyle.
Yes, absolutely.
Which I guess is why you can't have a template that you pull down off a shelf for any of the people you deal with, can you?
No, every transaction is bespoke in every regard. So you have to tailor the process, the tax planning, the legal advice bespoke to that particular situation. What's the biggest challenge out there, do you think, for people? Is it looking to sell? Is it making the first step? Is it understanding the support they're going to need to see it through? Is it where
I think the support side of it is massive, because sort of as Mike sort of alluded to, it's not something that they're used to doing on a day-to-day basis. So, corporate finance, that level of support, it's something that their in-house accountants, sort of their in-house management team won't be familiar with, because it's specialist. So I think it's actually sort of understanding what the process involves, the paperwork, everything that you have to go through it's a really big event. It's a big event, and I think emotionally quite often it's hard for the shareholders, for the people involved, because they just don't understand what's involved.
And how quickly typically could that whole process be complete?
Oh, I like to take as long as possible to give me plenty of time. I think pre-budget there was quite a lot of people scrambling around doing things quite quickly. I think, it's probably a 12-month process would be a reasonable estimate, start to finish.
Yeah, I mean, they say your business exit strategy should start on the first day you start a business, in theory, but clearly you don't officially start the process until you're ready to go. The most recent sale I was involved in, we were planning for 2 years, and there was a lot of tax planning involved as well as business planning as well. So there's no right or wrong answer, but you can't just put a for sale sign on front of the business one morning and get a buyer in the afternoon. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. There's a lot of preparatory work that's needed.
What do you, I'm interested to know, since you moved from one side of the fence to the other, what do you know now that you wish you'd known in your previous life?
It's a very good question. I'm struggling to answer that.
I'd never thought I'd make you speechless.
Yeah. Well, my true answer I don't think we can publish, but I guess when you're on the inside of a business, you can influence what information is presented and how it's presented in a far more effective way than if you're outside and as an advisor. So we could control the narrative as to how we were trading, the sectors that we were in, and present the business in a much stronger light than an advisor would ever be able to, because they're not involved in the business day to day. So you don't truly understand a business or a sector that they operate in unless you're actually in that business and that sector. So I think that was the big learning curve.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I could almost ask you from the flip side as well, what do you require, of a director, of a senior manager of a company, if you're going to do the best you can do for them?
So I think the starting point is probably actually being, if I'm supporting them, is be honest with me. Tell me what I need to know. Don't hold back. And then again, similar to you, but we can then frame the narrative as we need to. It's much easier, if you tell us everything, and we can then deal with that, rather than trying to not mention it and then sort of we get caught out at the last minute. So I think it's just being, open and honest from day one. Okay, so my final question to both of you, if there's one thing, if there's a business out there that's watching this and thinking, I'm thinking about selling, if there's one thing you'd encourage them to do, it would be what? Plan. Get advice. Basically, two sides of the same coin. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We've ended in agreement, which is a good way to finish, isn't it? Thank you both for your time. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Well, it's time now for our final discussion of the show. We were talking a little bit earlier about international trade and the idea of companies that are maybe looking to take their businesses overseas. We're going to reverse that a bit now and look at some of the issues involving companies that maybe want to do more business more closely right here in the UK and specifically in the Midlands. I'm delighted to be joined by two people who know all about this. We've got Håkon and Richard from Evelyn Partners. Just explain a bit about your two jobs then. Richard, what do you do?
Yeah, so I work in our employer solutions team. So my role is advising companies on all aspects relating to employing people in the UK, and equally if you're looking to move people in and out of the UK, also looking at domestic tax issues, taxation of packages, structuring those packages as well for your employees. So the whole breadth of taxes really and how it impacts your employees.
It's a broad portfolio, isn't it, that? And Håkon, from your point of view, what's your specialism?
So I specialise in customs advice, and so that involves both imports and exports, UK, worldwide, quite a lot of trade between EU and UK, obviously, and companies who want to establish themselves in the UK, I would help them with making sure they do things right and not spending more on duty, customs duty than necessary.
And we were talking right at the start of the show about the ramifications of the wide-ranging budget that we had a few days ago. How much of the budget feeds into what you two do then, from your point of view?
From my perspective, it was quite significant. I mean, it was a big budget in every sense of the word, particularly the amount of revenue that the government is looking to raise through additional tax. I think the headline was the increase in employers' national insurance rates going up to 15% from 13.8%. And we've looked at various scenarios how that could impact companies. And as an example, if you've got a company with a wage bill of about £5 million, 100 employees, in real terms that could be an increase in your national insurance bill by 18%, taking you up from about 550,000 to nearer 650,000. So it's a huge hike in terms of the employer national insurance costs. Other elements that companies are going to have to think about in the UK is there's been changes to the rates at which the national minimum wage, national living wage will need to be paid with effect from April next year. So again, an additional cost that is going to feed through to companies.
I guess from your point of view, the changes in the budget, when you're comparing them, it's more important to compare what other countries in other parts of Europe do rather than what we had in the UK before, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. You're sort of looking at this holistically. What's the cost to the employer, and particularly if you're looking at it from the angle of moving people around, is there some optimisation that you can look at to potentially not be paying those national insurance rates?
And Håkon, on the customs side of things, because the previous budget we had a lot about free ports and all sorts of things, didn't we? Not so much from your side this time?
No, not much at all actually. There was some discussions about free port before the announcement came out. There was some speculation about that it will be more free ports in the UK, in addition to, I believe, 12 that we have now. But as it turned out, it was a bit of a misunderstanding. What was intended was to have more customs areas within the existing free ports. And that's something that we kind of expected, because these free ports were launched not many years ago, and there's still a relatively new area that is under development and is being invested in these free ports. But other than the free ports, with these additional customs area, there really was not much in the budget that is affecting from a customs point of view. So no change to existing customs duty rates, no additional or any kind of like restrictions on the different duty reliefs that we have in the UK since many years. So not much change, no. Some on the excise, which I covered to some extent, but not on the customs side.
But of course, we also have a government only 100 odd days in who've said that they want to renegotiate the relationship with Europe, don't they, as well? So I guess over the next few months, there's lots of things that potentially you're going to be monitoring quite closely at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we talk about freedom of movement of people, what are they going to be looking to do in that sphere? So I think everything that we've got used to over the last 3 or 4 years, again, that could all be subject to renegotiation. Is
the UK still seen as an attractive place for an overseas company to come and invest now, either before or after the changes in the budget? Are we in demand?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interest. I mean, I can talk from the experience of the amount of interest that we are getting from companies, around the globe, where they are looking to move people in, and it's often an attractive idea if that you're a company that you've got your ownership outside the UK. You might want to think about, right, shall we get some of our senior executives to come and work in the UK, look at how it operates, how can we make our culture fit with that business in the UK? So it's still seen as quite an attractive rate. Our overall income tax rates are, they're not huge outliers in terms of being particularly low or expensive relative to the rest of the world. And equally on the corporate side, it's not seen as an overly expensive place to come and do business.
Is it as easy though as it used to be for people to make the transition into the UK?
It's harder for people because you have to think more around now, that whereas before, when you're within the European Union particularly, it was very easy with your UK passport to move around. You obviously need to think more around rights to work, rights to live in the UK. How long can I realistically have somebody over here working for a company in the UK? So that's definitely made it a lot more challenging.
And Håkan, on the customs side of things, in the months after Brexit, I'm sure you, the same as me, we talked to lots of businesses who exported, who were tearing their hair out at the amount of extra paperwork that was needed. Has that all settled down a bit now, is it?
Yes, well, if we think first of say, a company that is not an EU-based company, so say a US company who wants to start importing into the UK. For them, of course, Brexit really didn't make a difference. Whether we're part of the EU's customs territory or had our own customs territory, if you move goods from the US to the UK, there's still a customs declaration to be made, there's still customs duty potential to pay. So I think for overseas companies outside the EU, it really did not make that much of a difference, and actually the UK duty rates, customs duty rates, are slightly lower than the EU duty rates in general. So I think that the big difference was, of course, for the EU businesses. So say if you're an Italian jeweler, where you were used to having sold to UK customers without any kind of customs complication, for those businesses, it became a big change, and that it is now. What I see is that overseas companies within the EU are now starting to kind of get used to that. For a while, it was actually many businesses who decided we're not going to sell to the UK any longer; it's just too difficult. And those businesses are now starting to say, well, actually, it's still difficult, but we have to find a way because there's revenues to be made. We can't just ignore the UK. It's too big, too important market for us.
But by having a base then in the UK, that gets over some of those problems for them.
Yeah, often that is a much better option from a customs point of view. If you're establishing a UK company and the Italian companies sell to the UK company, and then the UK company sells to the UK end consumers. That's often a much better model. There is lower costs, and you will have access to duty reliefs as a UK business. If you're an Italian company, you cannot access all those reliefs that is available to a UK business.
And would these, Richard, typically be the kind of companies with the kind of issues that you're dealing with? Then
Absolutely, yeah. They're looking to move goods into the UK, looking to move people into the UK. You know, often it's a case of market expansion, and as I was saying earlier, often you want people who've got that strategic knowledge of the business overseas to say, right, how can we actually realistically get ourselves trading efficiently and developing our business in the UK? And that's where you'll have often your really good talent overseas. They'll be wanting to bring them into the UK and start to generate those the development of the business. So it's often a case of companies have to spend a lot of time identifying the right people, but I would say equally understanding how do you do business in the UK, how does it operate? It's often those intangibles, and particularly when you're moving people, making them comfortable when they come to the UK, that can often be your biggest hurdle.
You mentioned culture earlier, and that's one of the things, isn't it? You've got to get into the mindset of what British people, British employers, British employees will want and expect.
Yeah.
And is that part of an education process that you and your team would carry out?
We to be frank, we don't do a huge amount in that area. It's more giving them that framework of, if you bring somebody into the UK, in terms of employing them, how they're going to be taxed, how you might want to reward them in terms of structuring your package for those individuals. That's the kind of thing that they need to think about. Equally, does the company actually want to say, well, we'll keep that person legally employed overseas, and we'll effectively just try them working here temporarily for 2 years, see how that goes as well. If it goes well, the family settles, they might want to move across to the UK, then you're into the whole realm of, right, we're physically relocating somebody.
So I'm starting to build up a picture here about how many different elements there are that have to be thought about for this process. So I guess what you really want is to be in at ground level with these businesses before they start the planning process, I imagine, because otherwise you've got to maybe untangle things. Is that fair? Is that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's much better to get that advice up front. On the customs side, it's not everything is lost if you haven't thought of that. You can actually, I help clients every week to reclaim customs duties that they have overpaid because they didn't think of, say, the EU free trade agreement, for example, or they realized that they haven't classified their products correctly, so they have paid a higher duty rate than they should have. In those situations, you can typically reclaim the duty paid, and I do that quite a lot. So not everything is lost, but it's so much better not to have that realize too late that we're paying more than we should.
What's the first conversation that you would want to have with a business, when they're thinking about making the move?
Particularly if they're looking to move people, the kind of things that you need to understand are, what do you want them to actually be doing in the UK? So the nature of the work they're doing, how long are you planning on them coming over to the UK for? Depending on their home location, you have to think around things like, is this person, particularly say if they're based Central Europe, is this person actually going to be travelling in and out of the UK on a regular basis, as opposed to somebody maybe coming from the Asia Pacific area or North America who might just want to go for a more full-blown, right, I'm going to base myself in the UK on a full-time basis. So there's a lot to think around, whether there's going to be degrees of travel. And then the type of person that's coming over in terms of the role that they're doing. I mean, one thing that companies do struggle with, and this echoes Hawkins' point around having that pre-planning discussion, is if you're bringing, for example, a director of your overseas company into the UK and you decide, right, talking to my earlier point around getting these people familiar with how the UK business works, we'll put them on the board of directors in the UK. And companies just think, right, we've done that, we've got them that UK board role. Don't then decide to properly track how much time is that individual coming into the UK to do that board role. And unfortunately, you do get situations where you come to the event after a company's done this and it's been happening for 3 years, and you're having to tell the company you've actually got some tax to pay in the UK, and you know those hundreds of thousands of pounds that you might have been paying that person in bonuses and extra incentives, you've now got to pay tax on that cumulatively. If you're telling HMRC late, HMRC will say, well, we want some interest penalties. You can end up with a very hefty tax bill just from one individual having a few trips into the UK. And it really speaks to that wider point around, if you are going to start to look to do business more regularly in the UK and move people around, as an organisation, have you got process in place to actually track where your people are spending time? And as I say, a lot of my
These are
work,
things a lot of people won't even think about.
no, they won't. They won't. They'll look at the scenario of, well, this person's employed by us overseas, so you know we've maybe got them employed in the USA. They pay all the taxes in the USA. Yeah, they're in the UK a little bit, but not that often. We're okay, aren't we? And then you have to go back and say, well, again, you know, what have they been doing in the UK? How long for? And that's where it can very quickly unravel. And again, you've suddenly got quite a significant tax bill. So a lot of what we like to do is get in at that pre-planning phase and actually walk companies through, if this is strategically what you're looking to do, this is what you need to think about. You can put some planning in place that can mitigate your overall tax exposure. And you know, when we've actually done that groundwork, they know next time they look to do this, it's a lot easier to actually move people into the UK. They know what they need to be looking for.
And I know there's no such thing as a typical client that you'd be dealing with in this area, but roughly how long would the process take then from a time when you have an initial conversation to them actually being here, fully operational, job done, finished?
I mean, I've had scenarios where it's been turned around within, you know, a few months, less than 6 months. Sometimes going back to our earlier point around people having the right to work in the UK, you know, how quickly can you get that documentation from the Home Office? Some companies who are very forward thinking, they might be doing an 18-month lead-in time as well. So, you know, you want companies to be having those discussions as soon as possible, and probably once they've identified someone, I would always say that's the ideal point for us to come in and work with them to say what's going to be efficient for you in terms of how you structure their earnings, how you actually set up the working arrangements, what support do you want to be giving them to, you know, spouse, dependents, all those sorts of non-work related issues that still become part of what they need to be thinking about.
And Håkan, from your point of view, the same question really, what are the typical pitfalls, the things that people will forget about until it's too late from a customer's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, if you would be moving just goods into the UK and not people, you could in principle do that without having to set up a business. But most likely you're going to have to apply for a VAT number because you will make supply of services or goods in the UK. So I would say the best thing is to get us as advisors involved at least a good 3 months before you plan to start actually moving goods into the UK in your own name. The things to think about is making sure that you have advice already before the first goods arrive, so that you have the right classification, you have the right partners to help you. And it's with advice like I do, and it's also about getting a good freight forwarder, customs agent who can make that declaration and work with you. Many clients who don't really think about that relationship and outsource the declaration process to a third party without really giving many clear instructions what they want that third party to do. So that's something that I help with too, is to sit down with the client and say, well, these are the kind of instructions in writing you need to provide, otherwise things are is likely that the third party will take own initiative, and that could turn out horribly wrong.
And I imagine also with both of you, you've got quite a contacts book now in the area of people that you know you could recommend that your clients might want to talk to, whether it's freight forwarders, tax advisors, whatever it is. You know, you can point them and make sure they're talking to the right person, can't you? Because so often you can find yourself going round and round in circles to find the right person to chat to.
Absolutely. I think we're fortunate because we have quite a lot of specialisms within the firm. So most issues we will be able to help the client with, and it's nice because it's a one-stop shop in a way. But there's certainly, very niche services such as making customs declarations. We don't do that, but we can make sure that the client is finding the right partner to work with.
And has ticked all the boxes they need to tick. That's
Yeah.
the most important thing, isn't it? Håkan, we were sitting down almost exactly a year ago
Yep.
talking about business and particularly some customs-related chat. How different is the marketplace now compared to 12 months ago, or is it different?
Well, I think the businesses that already did import goods a year ago, with or without my help, they certainly know more now. There's, I think, a good level of information available, but there's a constant pipeline of overseas businesses that want to come and establish themselves in the UK. So there's quite a lot of companies. Well, they all face these kind of questions and challenges for the first time. So in that sense, not much have changed really. It's every week I come across businesses who haven't really thought about these things that we talk about. So in that sense, not much has changed. But yeah, every year that is passing since Brexit happened all those years ago, businesses are more well informed.
Final question from me then, really to both of you. How do you sell the benefits of being in the UK to an international company? Because obviously you're going to want to give them an incentive to let them know that it's worth them going through this process. What do you say are the big benefits to them?
I think the UK, the one thing I would say is certainly in the kind of area that we work in, but I think more generally, and this is talking to people who have run businesses overseas and have come into the UK, is they actually get a feeling you can actually work with people in the UK. You can work with businesses in the UK. It's not somewhere that's seen as a difficult place to trade or to bring people in and work. And a lot of people have a very positive experience. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lady who'd relocated and set up a business specifically in the Midlands. So not just thinking UK, she was actually thinking
a wise
I want
woman,
to come and work in
wise
Birmingham.
Woman.
Yeah, American lady, and 10 years later she's got a very successful business. So the more you hear those really positive anecdotes of people who've been effectively done it, it's been a success for them. I think you can point to that and almost say, well, why wouldn't you want to do it? There's no real drawbacks.
The whole been there, done it. If you can show a case study of somebody that's maybe in the same sector as they are, and say, look, point you in the direction of these people,
absolutely,
they can tell you from the horse's mouth, then, can't they?
Yeah.
Håkan, have the final word for us then. How do you sell the UK as a great place for overseas businesses?
Yeah, I think if you are, say, a business in Americas or Asia, it's the languages, I think, an advantage. They would typically speak English. They may not speak Swedish or any other language in Europe. So I think the language thing is an important one. From a customs point of view, HMRC is fair to deal with. Is not an overly complicated authority, and they do want traders to come here. They do want to facilitate trade. So as long as you get advice and not rush into something, you can usually make very good arrangements in the UK and use the UK as kind of the port, if you want, for your overall Europe businesses.
Perfect place to end. I think that's a wise piece of advice anyway. Take your time, whatever you're going to do. Make sure you've planned it out properly, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Richard Håkan, thank you so much for your time. That's it from Birmingham Business TV for this episode. Just remains to say a big thanks to the team from Evelyn Partners for hosting us in their fabulous premises here in Colmore Row. We've covered a fair bit of ground today, from the budget to business exits, international trade, lots besides. Just shows what kind of great expertise we've got right here in Birmingham. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.